The chair tried to eat me on my first day. Not literally, probably. On Kepler 9, you learned early to add that word to most sentences involving new environments. Probably not alive, probably not venomous, probably not going to collapse under your weight and drop you into whatever lives below floors on a space station that smells like copper and something that died sweet. The seat reconfigured when I sat down. Some pressure sensor in the cushion read my body type, ran it through a database of 50 known species, found the closest match, and decided I was a juvenile Vrethian. The cushion tightened around my legs like it had opinions. I did not panic. I noted the two nearest exits, the weight-bearing columns, the distance between me and the door, and then I reached down and manually peeled the seat adjustment lever until it stopped trying to classify me. The girl beside me, 4 arms folded neatly, shell-colored and chittering faintly to herself, watched this operation with very large eyes. I said it thought I was something else. She said, "What are you?" Mara Voss, human, Kepler 9 colony, 3rd generation. She made a sound I would later learn meant she was deciding whether to be afraid. Her name was Quill. She had more arms than I did and still somehow managed to look like the most nervous person in the room. I respected that. It takes real commitment to be nervous when you have 4 arms. The orientation hall held about 200 students, 12 species, according to the welcome packet they had sent me 4 months ago along with a scholarship notice that still felt like someone else's mail. The Galactic Institute of Unified Sciences, oldest academic institution in the explored sector, 47 accredited departments, 1 human. Me. I had read every document they sent, twice. Then I had read them a 3rd time because on Kepler 9 you do not walk into any new environment without knowing every exit, every structural weak point, and everything that might want to eat you. The Institute did not, to my knowledge, want to eat me, but I had cataloged the exits anyway. Old habits do not die. They wait in your back brain with their arms crossed, ready to be useful. The orientation speaker was a tall Sethian administrator named Voss Parallel 7. He had no relation to me despite the name overlap. He had 6 fingers on each hand and spoke with the patient authority of someone who had given this exact speech 400 times and found it satisfying every single time. He talked about the Institute's history. He talked about interspecies academic cooperation. He talked about the privilege of learning alongside minds shaped by entirely different evolutionary pressures. He did not mention humans specifically. There was one slide in his presentation that showed a graphic of all 12 enrolled species. It was colorful, detailed, and absolutely accurate. I was not on it. I checked the footnotes. There was one that said, edge case outlier populations, insufficient data for standard modeling, filed under Appendix C. Appendix C was not included in the welcome packet. I wrote that down, not because I was angry, because on Kepler 9 when something leaves you out of the map, you make your own. After orientation, Quill walked with me to the residential block. She had been assigned as my orientation guide, which she told me with the energy of someone who had lost a bet. I volunteered, she added quickly. Why? She made a clicking sound in her upper jaw. I have never met a human before. You are smaller than I expected. Most things that have met humans for the first time have said something like that. And then what happened to them? I thought about it honestly. They updated their expectations. She clicked again. I decided that was her laugh. The residential block was built for standard comfort species. My bunk was sized for a Vrethian adolescent again. I was beginning to suspect the Institute had exactly 1 data point for human dimensions, and that data point was wrong. The mattress was too short by about 8 centimeters. The pillow had a recess shaped for a head with more cranium than I had. I folded my jacket, put it under the pillow, and slept with my back to the wall, the way I always did. Quill, across the room in her own bunk, watched me arrange myself and said, "You sleep like you expect something to happen." "I sleep like nothing can get me," I said. She was quiet after that. I could hear her thinking. Thressi think loudly, not telepathically, just physically. They shift their weight and their shell plates make small adjustments, and the room fills with tiny sounds like a house settling. I found it easier to sleep than silence. The first week was mostly navigation. The Institute was built across 4 connected rings, each one rotating at a slightly different speed for different gravity needs. Getting from one ring to another required going through adjustment corridors that shifted gravity gradually, so your body had time to complain about it before it had to work properly. My body did not complain. Kepler 9 gravity runs about 1.2 standard. The Institute's heaviest ring was 1.15. I walked through the adjustment corridor at the same pace I walked everywhere. The Rethian student ahead of me grabbed both handrails and took it step by careful step. I passed him. He stared. I had been stared at in every corridor, every meal hall, every lecture space since I arrived. Not with hostility, mostly with the particular attention you give something you do not have a category for. I was too small for a fighter species, too large for a comfort species, too calm for something that should, by their models, be struggling with the environmental stresses of leaving a familiar world. I was not struggling, I was cataloging. Those are different things. By the end of the first week, I had memorized the floor plan of all 4 rings, identified the 3 meal service points with the longest protein options, found the only study room in Ring 2 that had a window facing the exterior hull, and learned that the Thressi phrase for "I am paying attention even though I do not look like it" was almost identical to the phrase for "I am about to do something inadvisable." Quill confirmed this was a known translation hazard. I asked her if the Institute had any human students before me. She said there was one 8 years ago. He lasted 1 semester. What happened? He was homesick. I thought about Kepler 9, the eastern wind that came in low and fast and took 3 kids from our colony block before I was 10. The way the soil grew things you could eat if you boiled them long enough, and things that would eat you if you didn't notice them first. The sky that was the color of an old bruise for about 4 months every year because of the particulate from the southern volcanic shelf. Homesick. The math on that didn't math for me. I told Quill I was not planning to leave. She made the click sound again. Then she said, "I know, you sleep like something that does not plan to leave." My academic schedule had 6 courses. 5 were manageable with work. One was Professor Dorak's Xenocognitive Theory, which was the flagship course of the Institute's neuroscience department, and was, on paper, exactly what I had come here to study. I had seen Dorak once during orientation week, from across a courtyard. He was Uvathi, 7 feet of chalk-pale exoskeleton, 3 jointed arms, the kind of walk that means the floor is grateful for the chance. He had the academic authority of someone who has never once been wrong in a room that was paying attention and has organized his entire personality around that fact. I looked at him and did what I always do with new things. I cataloged him. Exit points from his joints, 3 per arm, articulated but not flexible past a certain angle. Weight distribution. Front heavy, meaning balance correction would be slow on his right side. Height. Significant advantage in a stand-up situation, but the exoskeleton means reduced motion speed in close range. I was not planning a situation. I was just doing the math I always do. On Kepler 9, you do the math first, then you decide if it matters. I decided to go to his class and learn what he knew and see if he was as smart as his walk suggested. That was the plan. Plans on Kepler 9 have a saying. We say, make one, then be ready for it to become something else entirely. I sat in the front row of Dorek's class on the first Monday and opened my notebook. He walked in, set down his materials, looked across the room and said, "The human." Not my name, not a welcome, the human. I wrote that down too. Then class began, and I paid attention. And what I found in the next 50 minutes was more interesting and more dangerous than anything I had cataloged so far. Not because the material was hard. Because the material was wrong. Not all of it. Most of it was elegant and precise and built on solid research. But running through the center of it, like a load-bearing wall with a crack in it, was one assumption so large and so unquestioned that the whole structure leaned on it. The assumption was this: threat response costs cognition. Species with high survival pressure neurologies, according to Dorek's model, traded upper cognitive function for speed. The brain, he said, under chronic threat conditions, routes resources away from abstract processing toward immediate physical response. This made such species faster and more reactive, and less capable of the higher reasoning functions that made academic learning possible. I read this slide 3 times. Then I looked at my notes from the past 7 days, the floor plans, the gravity calculations, the exit routes, the structural analyses, the cataloged behavioral patterns of 63 new species processed and filed and cross-referenced in the time it took most students to find their dormitory. I thought about the eastern wind. I raised my hand. He looked at me, said, "Yes, the human." I said, "Your threat response model. It assumes that survival cognition and abstract cognition draw from the same fixed resource pool." He said, "That is correct." What is the evidence that the pool is fixed? The room did the thing rooms do when the air pressure changes. Dorek looked at me with the patience of a continental shelf. The evidence, he said, is 40 years of peer-reviewed xenocognitive research conducted across 11 species. I said, 11 species that were not from high-threat Deathworld environments. He said, "The data is comprehensive." I looked at the slide, then at him. "I am not on your slide," I said. He said, "The human population represents an edge case outlier with insufficient data for standard modeling." He said it the way someone reads a footnote, like it was already answered, like the answer was obvious and the question was the problem. I wrote it down. Class continued. I paid attention to every word. I had a feeling I was going to need all of it. The first quiz came back with a score that should not have been possible given how much I had studied. I stared at the paper. 41 out of 100. Nearly every wrong answer was wrong in the same direction. I had understood the material. I had processed it through the framework I use for everything, the one that runs threat weight analysis alongside conceptual modeling, the one that had kept me and everyone around me alive on Kepler 9 for 19 years. The framework was not in Dorek's rubric. The rubric wanted me to reproduce the model. His model, the one with the crack in the wall. Quill found me in the study room with the hull window, notes spread across the table, the quiz paper sitting separate from everything else like something in quarantine. She said, "How did you do?" I said 41. She made a sound that was not her laugh. "Mara." I understood every question, I said. I answered from a different framework. His framework is the curriculum. His framework has an incorrect assumption at its center. Quill sat down. All 4 arms settled in the particular way that meant she was choosing her words. You know that saying something is wrong and being able to prove it are different things. I know. And you know that even if you can prove it, the proving has to happen in a way he can hear it. I looked out the whole window. The star field was very still. "I know that too," I said. She said, "What are you going to do?" I thought about the eastern wind, how you do not fight it. You read it, you calculate it, you find the angle where it carries you instead of taking you. I am going to keep paying attention, I said, and wait for the moment where the proof makes itself. I did not know then how close that moment was. I did not know what it would cost. But on Kepler 9, you do not wait for a situation to be comfortable before you walk into it. You just make sure you know where the exits are. The second week of class, Dorek ran a practical session, cognitive mapping under simulated stress conditions. Each student was connected to a neural response monitor and walked through a scenario designed to activate their species-typical threat response sequence. The purpose, he said, was to observe resource routing in real time. One by one, students went through. The Vrethian students showed clean response arcs. The Vrethian pair showed the wide bandwidth pattern typical of their hive-adjacent neural architecture. The Sethian student showed a beautiful bilateral split that Dorek noted with visible satisfaction. Then it was my turn. I sat down, they placed the monitor, the scenario began. I will not describe what the scenario involved, because it was designed for a species that registers threat through narrowband sensory channels. For me, it registered as about a 4 out of 10 on the scale I use for actual concerning situations. But my brain did what my brain does. It ran the full sequence, every variable, every exit, every structural weak point, every behavioral pattern of every person in the room cross-referenced against every outcome where things go wrong. All of it, simultaneously, while also processing the scenario logic and filing the academic content of the exercise and tracking Quill's position in my peripheral vision, because she is my friend and I track my people. The monitor registered this as a malfunction. Dorek looked at the readout, then at me, then back at the readout. He said, the equipment appears to have experienced an error during the human session. I said, the equipment was working fine. He said, the output is not consistent with any known cognitive pattern. I said, yes. He looked at me with the patience that was beginning to feel less like patience and more like a door he kept closed. We will note your session as inconclusive, he said, and continue. He moved on to the next student. I sat with my results on the monitor screen, every channel firing at once. The model said that was a system error. I knew what it actually was. The proof was sitting right there. He had just decided it was noise. I went back to my seat, wrote it down, every number. Quill leaned over and looked at my notes and made a soft sound. Mara, she said quietly. I know, I said. He is not going to see it. Not yet, I said. Not yet. The third quiz came back at 44, slightly better, still failing by the rubric standards, still completely coherent by mine. I did not go to office hours. There was no point going to a conversation where only one framework was valid and it was not mine. Instead, I mapped every question he had ever asked against the assumption I believed was wrong, and I built, slowly and without announcing it to anyone, the outline of a countermodel. Not because I thought I would get to present it. Because on Kepler 9, when you cannot change the weather, you understand it completely. Understanding is never wasted. Quill asked me one night, when I had been working until the corridor lights dimmed to sleep cycle level, do you actually like this subject, or are you just refusing to lose? I thought about it honestly. Both, I said, is that allowed? She clicked, on most worlds those are the same thing. I went back to my notes. Somewhere across the institute, in an office with his name on the door in 4 languages, Professor Dorek was preparing for the oral examination sessions. I was preparing too. We were both, in our own ways, about to find out what happens when an immovable model meets something it never bothered to account for. The oral examination was scheduled for the following Monday. Every student, front of the class, Answer 3 questions on the xenocognitive model, demonstrate understanding of the core framework, show your reasoning aloud. Quill practiced for 6 days. She was thorough, precise, and knew the model better than the model knew itself. I did not practice his model. I practiced mine. Not because I was trying to fail, because when I stood in front of that room and answered his questions, I was going to answer them with the truth I had been building for 6 weeks, not to be difficult, not to cause a scene. Because every answer I had given from his model had been a wrong answer dressed up in acceptable language, and I was done wearing clothes that did not fit. I was going to stand up there and tell him what was actually true. And then I was going to find out what he did with that. I already knew, somewhere in my back brain, that it was not going to go cleanly. I went to sleep that Sunday night with my back against the wall and my notes memorized, and the layout of the classroom filed under things I know and do not need to revisit. I slept well. That is not nothing. On Kepler 9, sleeping well before a hard thing is the only kind of preparation that actually counts. Monday morning, I ate breakfast. Protein options, Quill beside me working through her notes one more time, the meal hall filling with students who all had the particular quiet of people about to be evaluated. I watched the room, counted exits, drank my water. Ready. The examination room was the same as always. Rows of seats, the elevated front platform, the display wall behind it running the course's header graphic. Students filed in. Dorek was already there. He did not look at me when I walked in. I sat in my usual seat, front row, 3 meters from the platform. He called students up in alphabetical order by species designation. Human comes late in his alphabet. I waited. I watched how he handled each student. Precise questions, precise corrections, the particular satisfaction he took in a model being reproduced cleanly. He liked it when students spoke his framework back to him with confidence. You could see it in the way his exoskeleton sat when they did that. Something settled. My turn came 40 minutes in. The human, he said. I stood, walked to the front, stood on the platform facing the room. Quill was in the 3rd row. She was making the sound that in Thressi means, I am watching and I cannot stop what is about to happen, and I have accepted this. Dorek asked his first question, standard framework question, resource allocation under cognitive stress. I answered it the way I actually understood it, which was not his way. I said, threat-adapted cognition does not split the resource pool. It expands the processing range. The data from my practical session 3 weeks ago shows simultaneous activation across all channels, not resource displacement between channels. Your model predicts one at the expense of the other. My neural map shows both running at full capacity. The room was very still. He said that session was marked inconclusive due to equipment error. I said the equipment was working. You can verify this with the technician's log. I already did. Something changed in the room. Not a sound, more like a pressure shift. The kind you feel in your ears on Kepler 9 right before the eastern wind changes direction. Dorek looked at me for a long moment. You have misunderstood the model, he said. I have understood it exactly, I said. I disagree with its foundational assumption. You are a first-year student. Yes. With 3 failing quiz scores. Failing by a rubric built on the model I am telling you is incorrect. Yes. The room had the quality of a held breath. 200 students in chairs, not one of them moving. Dorek stepped closer. I noted the movement, filed it, kept my eyes on his. You will answer the question as asked, he said, using the course framework. I will answer it accurately, I said. He asked the question again. I gave the same answer. He raised his right arm. I registered it in the part of my brain that registers everything. A Uvathi disciplinary gesture. Open palm directed at the shoulder. In his culture, a teacher's correction. The equivalent of tapping a desk to get attention. About 40 newtons, maybe 45. Not aggressive by his species standards. Not aggressive by any standard he had ever needed to consider. His palm connected with my left shoulder. My back brain did not ask for context. It did not request a cultural briefing. It registered contact, unexpected overhead angle, close range. It did what it was built to do. My right hand caught his forearm. My left hand braced at his second joint. I turned my body. His arm bent. The wrong direction. The sound it made was not loud. The silence after it was the loudest thing I had ever been inside. Dorak's face went through 3 expressions in about 1 second. Pain, disbelief, and then something older and stranger, something that looked, if I am honest, a little like the first moment of understanding. I let go. Stepped back. My hands were completely steady. The room did not move. Quill, in the 3rd row, had all 4 arms wrapped around herself in a shape that meant she was holding something in very tightly. I looked at Dorak. His arm was hanging at the wrong angle from the second joint. He was breathing through it, controlled, the Uvathi way of managing pain. I said, "I am sorry for the injury." He looked at me. "That was not," he said carefully, "an intentional correction on your part." "No," I said, "it was not. It was a reflex." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the precision of someone filing a report in their own head, "Threat response activation, non-volitional, physical output preceding cognitive override." "Yes," I said again. He looked at his arm. Then back at me. "You will report to the academic office," he said, "as will I." I nodded. I walked off the platform. The room still hadn't moved. I picked up my bag from the front row, adjusted the strap, and walked to the door. Quill fell into step beside me in the corridor without a word. She walked close, not touching, just present. We walked the whole length of Ring 2 without speaking. At the adjustment corridor, she said, very quietly, "Are you all right?" I thought about the question. Not the answer I was supposed to give, the real one. "I was thrown back 5 years," I said. She did not ask what I meant. Quill was smart enough by then to know that certain sentences are whole stories compressed into their smallest possible form. She just walked with me. That was enough. The academic tribunal was held 4 days later. 7 board members, 6 species, 1 long table in a room that was designed to feel institutional, which it achieved with impressive commitment. The ceiling was high. The chairs were hard. The air had the quality of recycled decisions. I sat on one side of the room. Dorak sat on the other side, his arm in a biosplint, which was a pale blue color, and which I could not stop noticing the way you notice a thing you caused. There was a moderator, a Sethian named Vosh, who had the professional neutrality of someone paid to have no opinions about anything. Vosh said, "This hearing is to review the incident in Professor Dorak's oral examination session. We will hear testimony from both parties and from relevant witnesses before determining appropriate academic action." Relevant witnesses meant the 31 students who had been in the room. It turned out that 11 of them had filed their own accounts of the incident before the tribunal was even scheduled. These accounts, without coordination, had all noted the same sequence of events in the same order. Disciplinary gesture first, reflex response second. Nobody had planned for that. Dorak, I noticed, had not planned for that. Vosh reviewed the witness statements first, read them without expression, then set them down. "Professor Dorak," he said, "the witness accounts are consistent. Would you like to speak to the sequence of events as described? Dorek was quiet for a moment. The disciplinary gesture, he said, is a standard Uvathi educational practice. It was not intended as a physical threat. Vosh said, that is noted. And do you believe the student understood that intent? A long pause. I believe, Dorek said, that she responded in a manner consistent with her neurological profile. The room adjusted to that sentence in a few different ways. Vosh said, and whose responsibility was it to understand that neurological profile before employing a species-specific disciplinary gesture? Dorek said nothing. Vosh moved on. Ms. Voss, your account. I had written mine out in advance, not because I was nervous, because I wanted it exact. I said, the reflex response was non-volitional. My nervous system registered unexpected physical contact from an overhead angle and responded before cognitive processing could intercede. This is not unusual for individuals from high-threat environments. It is, in fact, precisely the kind of involuntary survival response that xenocognitive theory is supposed to model and study. I paused. It is not modeled, I said. Humans from Kepler 9 colony are listed as edge case outliers in Appendix C of the course supplement, which was not included in the student welcome materials. Vosh looked at his documents, back at me. You are saying the course material did not account for your species' neurological responses. I am saying the course material actively excluded them, and that this exclusion is not a gap in data. It is an error in the model's foundational assumptions. I pulled out my notes. I put them on the table. I have been building the counter-analysis for 6 weeks, I said. I would like to submit it as evidence and as a formal academic challenge to the course framework. The board looked at the notes. Then at me. Then at Dorek. Dorek looked at the notes for a long time. He said nothing. Vosh picked up the document. Read the first page. Turned to the second. His expression did not change because Sethians are professionally trained to not have expressions, but something behind his eyes sharpened in a way that meant the document was doing what I needed it to do. The hearing went for 3 hours. At the end, Vosh called a 30-minute deliberation recess. I sat in the corridor outside on a bench that was sized, predictably, for a Vrethian adolescent. Quill sat beside me, all 4 arms folded, shell plates making their small sounds. She said, "How do you feel?" I said, like someone who did the only thing they could do and is waiting to find out what it costs. She said, "That is a very long answer for you." I am tired, I said. She leaned slightly in my direction. In Thressi body language this means I am here and I am not going anywhere. She had told me this early in our friendship, very deliberately, so I would not misread it. I had appreciated that more than I said. We waited. The board reconvened. Vosh read the verdict with the voice of someone delivering a weather report. No academic expulsion, no suspension, a formal review of the xenocognitive course curriculum to assess the completeness of its species modeling, a mandatory supplemental module on Deathworld neurology to be developed for inclusion in the next academic cycle. Professor Dorak to issue a formal correction to his course materials in writing, with specific reference to the foundational assumption identified in the submitted counter-analysis. And a note entered into the Institute's academic record, acknowledging that Mara Voss, human, Kepler 9 colony, had raised a valid structural challenge to a core piece of the Institute's flagship neuroscience curriculum. Not a footnote. A record. I sat with that for a moment. Quill made the click sound, the laugh. I looked at Dorak across the room. He was reading the verdict document with the focused attention of someone processing something they did not expect to have to process. He looked up, our eyes met. He held the look for 3 full seconds. Then he looked back down. I stood up, collected my notes, and walked out with Quill into the corridor and the rotating light of Ring 2 and the particular smell of a place that was beginning, very slowly, to feel like it had a space in it that was the right shape for me. Not comfortable, not easy, but mine. We got dinner. Protein options for me, Quill's chelated mineral plate for her, the meal hall full and loud and entirely indifferent to what had just happened in a tribunal room on the other side of the ring. That was fine. I did not need the meal hall to know. I knew. That was enough. 6 weeks after the tribunal, a departmental assistant knocked on my study room door. I say my study room because by that point it was understood, informally, by everyone on Ring 2, that the room with the hull window at the end of the east corridor was mine on weekday evenings. Nobody had told anyone this. It had simply become true. Quill said this was because I had done the thing where I sit somewhere and make it clear, without moving or saying anything, that this is where I am now, and that is simply how things are. I said I did not know what she was talking about. She clicked. The departmental assistant was a young Sethian named Oral, very organized. The kind of organized where their files are alphabetized and also subalphabetized, and the idea of an Appendix C not being included in a welcome packet would cause them actual physical distress. Oral said, "Professor Dorak requests your availability for a consultation. Department of Xenocognitive Theory, regarding the curriculum revision." I looked at Oral. Oral looked back with professional neutrality. "He is asking me," I said. "Yes." "To help revise the course that I failed." "You did not technically fail the course. Your final assessment was regraded under the tribunal's supplemental review guidelines, and you received a 68. 68. It is a passing grade. I thought about this. 68. For 6 weeks of work that had, by my accounting, correctly identified the single most significant methodological error in a 40-year body of research. 68. The math on that still didn't math. But I said yes. Not because 68 deserved a yes, because the work deserved a yes. The actual problem, the real one, the one sitting in the foundation of the model with its load-bearing crack running all the way through the structure. That problem deserved someone who could fix it. And I was, at this point, the most qualified person on this station to do that. Oral nodded, made a note and left. Quill, who had been in the room the whole time and had been pretending to study with great focus, looked up. "You said yes," she said. "Yes. To working with the professor who failed you. To fixing the problem I found. Those are the same situation. They are 2 different reasons for the same action." She made the sound that in Thresi means, "I understand exactly what you mean, and I think you are being very brave in a way you would not call brave." I collected my notes and went to find a new notebook. The consultation room Dorak had arranged was in the academic wing of Ring 1. It had a window. I noticed this when I walked in. A real hull window, wide, facing the star field on the side of the station that gets the long view. I sat down and looked at the window for one moment before looking at Dorak. He was sitting across the table. His arm was out of the splint. Uvathi healing is faster than human healing because their exoskeleton does most of the structural work. The joint looked normal. I was glad about this in a way I did not say out loud. He said I was incorrect. I waited. He seemed to believe this was the end of the sentence. I said yes. He tried again. The model has a structural exclusion problem. The foundational assumption treats cognitive resource allocation as a fixed-sum system. Your counter-analysis presents evidence that high-threat neurological development produces an expanded processing architecture rather than a redistributed one. Yes. I reviewed the neural monitor data from your practical session. The technician confirmed the equipment was functioning correctly. I know. I should have reviewed it at the time. I said nothing. He looked at me in the way someone looks at something they have been deciding how to see for several weeks. Why did you not bring the data to me directly, he said, after the session, when I called it an equipment error? I thought about the eastern wind. Because, I said, the data was not the problem. The assumption was, and you cannot show someone a fact that contradicts their assumption and expect the assumption to move. You have to show them enough facts from enough angles that the assumption becomes harder to hold than it is to release. He was quiet. You were building a case, he said. I was doing the only thing that made sense. For 6 weeks. Yes. He looked at his notes, then back at me. That is, he said, and then stopped, started again. That kind of sustained analytical patience under adverse conditions is not consistent with the cognitive profile the course framework predicts for Deathworld origin individuals. No, I said, it is not. Which is evidence for your countermodel. Which is evidence for my countermodel, I agreed. He wrote something down. I watched him write it. I did not know what to do with a 7-foot exoskeletal academic writing down the thing I said like it was worth keeping. On Kepler 9, you do not expect the things you know to be recorded anywhere. You know them so you can use them. You do not expect them to become curriculum. I looked at the window. The star field was the same as it always was. Still very far, completely indifferent to everything happening on the station. I found that calming. I always had. We worked for 3 hours that first session. He walked me through the model's architecture from the foundation up, and I walked him through every point where the foundation's assumption created a downstream error, and we were not warm with each other and we were not easy, but we were, both of us, extremely precise. Precision is its own kind of language. By the end of the session, we had identified 4 structural revision points. He had corrected 2 of them before we finished. The third required additional data that neither of us currently had. The fourth was the big one. The fourth was the assumption itself, resource allocation as fixed sum. To correct it properly, to revise the model in a way that held up to peer review, we needed a new dataset. Neural response profiles from high-threat origin populations, properly collected, properly analyzed, built into the model's core from the start instead of filed in an appendix nobody received. Dvorak looked at this problem and said, "This will require a research proposal and a new study." I said, "Yes." "It will take at least 2 academic cycles." "Yes." "You would need to be involved in the data collection." I said, "Is that an offer?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It is a recognition that you are the most relevant available resource for this research." I thought about being called a resource. Then I thought about being called a resource by a man who 6 weeks ago called me the human and looked through me like a footnote. This was better, not by a lot, but by something. I said, "I want co-authorship on the revised model." He said, "That is appropriate given your contribution." I said, "And I want the data from my practical session included in the foundational evidence, attributed correctly." "Yes." "And the counter-analysis I submitted to the tribunal." "Also yes." I looked at him. He looked back. Something had shifted in the room in the way things shift, when 2 people who have been arguing with the same wall from different sides of it finally find themselves on the same side. Not friends. Not yet, maybe not ever. The distance between a Uvathi professor and a Kepler 9 colony kid is not closed by 3 hours of equations. But something. I asked, "Why did you agree to the window?" He said, "What?" "This room has a hull window. You arranged this room." A pause. Then, I reviewed your student file before requesting this consultation. It noted that you study in the East Corridor room on Ring 2 because it has a hull window. I looked at the window again. He had read my file well enough to know I liked windows. I filed that information, didn't know what to do with it yet. All right, I said. When do we start on the research proposal? I had expected more resistance to the co-authorship terms, he said. You gave me everything I asked for. You asked for appropriate things. I looked at him. Yes, I said, I did. We started on the research proposal that same evening. It was not warm. It was not comfortable. We disagreed on methodology 4 times in the first hour. He was precise to the point of being slow, and I was fast to the point of skipping steps he considered essential. We found a pace eventually. The way 2 people find a pace when they are both determined to get somewhere, and have recently established that neither of them is planning to stop. Quill was waiting outside the academic wing when I came out 2 hours later. She had brought food. Protein pack for me, mineral flask for her. She handed me mine without a word, which is how Quill shows she cares about something, by showing up with the right supplies. We walked back toward Ring 2. She said, "How was it?" I said, "Productive. Just productive. And strange." Strange how? I thought about the window, about him writing down the thing I said, about the 4th revision point and the 2 academic cycles it would take to fill it. Strange like something that was one shape is becoming a different shape, I said, and I do not have the name for the new shape yet. Quill ate her minerals. In Thressi there is a word for that. What word? It does not translate well. It means roughly, the moment when something difficult becomes something else difficult, and you realize you prefer this version. I chewed on my protein. Looked at the corridor lights. Thought about Appendix C, and the eastern wind, and 68 out of 100, and a man who arranged a room with a window before I ever walked into it. Yes, I said, that word. The model was wrong. We were fixing it. I was the reason it was being fixed. Not a footnote. Not an edge case outlier. An axiom at the center of a new way of understanding how minds work when the world around them is not safe, and they survive it anyway, not in spite of their thinking, but because of it. The corridor lights shifted to evening cycle, softer, longer shadows. Quill made her click sound beside me. I did not smile. I do not smile often. But something in my back brain settled. The part that always looks for exits. The part that counts load-bearing columns. The part that has never once in 19 years had the luxury of assuming everything was going to be fine. That part just for a moment went quiet. Not because everything was fine. Because the work was real and the work was mine, and that was enough to go on. That has always been enough to go on.